Good afternoon. So in the 6th of February, today we are hosting Dr. Birol Tibet through our RareBoost project in IBG, İzmir Biomedicine and Genome Center. And RareBoost is for the research and soft skill capacity building project supported by European Union to develop rare disease implementation, rare disease related work implementation to IBG and the region. So we are covering the different aspects of the rare disease from patient diagnosis, undiagnosed, solving the undiagnosed cases, therapy development, and also training. And of course, health technology assessment is one of the key parts of these processes. And Dr. Birol Tibet is one of the experts for this knowledge. And currently he is assistant professor of public health at Bahcesehir University in Istanbul, and physician and also health economist with multidisciplinary training in medicine, public health, health economics, and healthcare management. His work focuses on health technology assessment and economics and outcome research, market access, and innovation policy across pharmaceutical, medical devices, and biotechnology. He has been worked in Ministry of Health, World Health Organization, and also IBG previously, and he is engaged with global professional networks and currently serves as Turkey National Mirror Group representative in ongoing Erdera project. Today, his talk is titled Designing Research with Impact, Integrating Early HTA and HEOR into Preclinical Innovation, which is very relevant for our work. Thank you, Birol, and please.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be back at İzmir Biomedicine and Genome Center and take part in the IBG external seminar series under RareBoost project. Today, I would like to talk about a topic that sits at the intersection of preclinical research, health systems, and real-world decision-making. Namely, how we can design research with impact by integrating health technology assessment and health economics and outcomes research early in the innovation process. The core idea I would like to explore with you is a simple one. Designing research for real-world impact starts much earlier than we often assume. This seminar is not about evaluating research after it is completed, and it is not about imposing external constraints on scientific creativity. Rather, it is about how early design choices shape what kinds of decisions our research will eventually be able to support. With that in mind, let me start by briefly explaining why this conversation has become particularly important now. So why is this conversation necessary now? First, we are operating in an increasingly competitive environment for public research funding. both nationally and internationally. Funding institutions are no longer asking only whether a project is scientifically sound, but also what kind of difference it is likely to make beyond the laboratory. Second, innovation cycles in health research are accelerating. The time between early discovery and downstream decision-making is becoming shorter, which means that many design choices made very early on are harder and more expensive to revisit later. And third, we are seeing a growing gap between discovery and adoption. Many projects produce excellent scientific results, yet struggle to be taken up by health systems, regulators, or payers, simply because they were not designed with those later decisions in mind. Taken together, these developments suggest a simple but important reality. Scientific merit alone is no longer sufficient. This does not diminish the importance of rigorous science. Rather, it raises the question of how scientific excellence can be aligned early on with the kinds of decisions that determine real-world impact. Up to this point, I've talked about why this conversation is becoming more important. This slide is about where things typically start to go wrong. On the left, you see what most of us are very familiar with, the discovery and preclinical research pipeline. This is where scientific questions are formulated, experiments are designed, and evidence is generated. It is also where most academic research effort is naturally concentrated. On the right, you see a very different pipeline, the one that begins when health systems, funders, regulators, or payers start asking whether that evidence is sufficient to support a real-world decision. These questions are not primarily about novelty or internal validity, but about relevance, comparability, feasibility, and value. What separates these two pipelines is what I will refer to today as the impact gap. Importantly, this gap is not caused by poor science. It exists because the questions that matter for downstream decisions often emerge after many critical design choices have already been made upstream. The central argument of this seminar is that if we want research to travel more effectively from discovery to impact, some of these downstream questions need to be anticipated much earlier, while design is still flexible. To understand what those questions are, we first need to understand how health systems think about value. To understand how research moves from discovery to real-world impact, we first need to pause and clarify a deceptively simple question. What do health systems actually mean when they talk about value? From a scientific perspective, we often equate value with measures such as efficacy, mechanistic insight, or novelty. These are, of course, essential. But once evidence enters a health system context, value is understood much more broadly. First, there's clinical benefit. Not only whether an intervention works, but how much it improves outcomes compared to what already exists. Second, health systems increasingly focus on patient-relevant outcomes, such as quality of life, daily functioning, and outcomes that matter to patients beyond traditional clinical endpoints. Third, there is the question of system efficiency and affordability. Even highly effective innovations must be feasible to deliver and sustainable when applied at scale. And finally, value is strongly shaped by equity and unmet need, including disease severity, the availability of alternatives, and who stands to benefit from an innovation. The key point here is not that any single dimension dominates, but that value in health systems is inherently multidimensional. This broader understanding of value sets the stage for how evidence is later assessed and decisions are ultimately made. At this point, it is useful to introduce a term that often generates strong reactions, but is frequently misunderstood: health technology assessment, or HTA. At its core, HTA is a structured, evidence-informed process that exists to support healthcare decision-making. It brings together information on clinical effects, economic implications, and broader system considerations to help decision makers understand the consequences of adopting or not adopting a given technology. HTA is used by a range of actors, including public payers, ministries of health, and dedicated HTA agencies, and sometimes also by funders and policymakers. Importantly, these actors are not asking whether the science is interesting or innovative in an academic sense. They are asking whether the available evidence can support a responsible real-world decision. The types of questions addressed through HTA are therefore very practical. Does this technology provide meaningful additional benefit compared to existing options? Who is likely to benefit? Is it feasible to deliver? And is it sustainable when applied at scale? This is where some common misconceptions arise. HTA is often perceived as a cost-cutting exercise or as something that stands in opposition to innovation. In reality, HTA is neither. It does not judge scientific quality, and it does not exist to block innovation. Instead, HTA functions as a decision support framework, one that helps health systems make transparent, evidence-based choices under real-world constraints. With that understanding in place, the next question becomes not whether HTA matters, but when its perspective should start to inform research. Once we understand what HTA is and what it is meant to do, the next and more interesting question is when its perspective should come into play. Traditionally, HTA is applied relatively late, when a technology is already well-defined and much of the evidence base is fixed. At that point, HTA functions primarily as an evaluative process, with limited opportunity to influence how the research was designed in the first place. Early HTA represents a different way of thinking. It applies the same decision-oriented logic much earlier, often during preclinical research or early development, when uncertainty is still high, but design choices are still flexible. The timing matters because many of the issues that later become barriers to adoption are shaped by early decisions. What comparator is implicitly assumed, which outcomes are prioritized, and what scale or use setting is envisioned. Early HTA does not aim to predict final reimbursement decisions or produce precise economic estimates. Instead, it helps researchers ask better questions earlier. In practical terms, early HTA can inform study design, help define the appropriate scope of an innovation, and guide the selection of endpoints that will later matter to decision makers. The key message is this: early HTA is not an evaluation verdict. It is a design tool. Its value lies in shaping research while meaningful choices are still possible. If HTA provides a structured way of thinking about value and supporting decisions, the next question is where the evidence for those assessments actually comes from. This is where health economics and outcomes research, or HEOR, enters the picture. HEOR is a broad field of research that focuses on understanding both the economic consequences and the real-world outcomes associated with health technologies. Its purpose is not to replace clinical evidence, but to complement it by addressing questions that matter once an intervention is considered for real-world use. One component of HEOR is health economics, which looks at issues such as cost effectiveness, budget impact, and how resources are used within a health system. These analyses help decision makers understand not just whether something works, but whether it can be delivered sustainably. Another component is outcomes research, which focuses on what happens to patients in practice, including quality of life, patient-reported outcomes, and functional outcomes that may not be fully captured by traditional clinical endpoints. Increasingly, HEOR also draws on real-world evidence generated outside tightly controlled experimental settings to understand how technologies are actually used and how their effects vary across populations and contexts. Taken together, HEOR provides the types of evidence that HTA relies on to assess value in a comprehensive and meaningful way. The important point for today is not methodological detail, but the recognition that HEOR is what translates scientific findings into decision-relevant evidence. At this point, we can put the pieces together. On the left, we have discovery and preclinical research, where scientific evidence is generated, mechanistic insights, mechanistic insights, proof of concept data, and early signals of efficacy. This is where most academic effort is naturally concentrated. On the right, we have real-world decisions about coverage, access, prioritization, and implementation within health systems. These decisions are not made on the basis of scientific interest alone, but on structured assessments of value. HTA and HEOR together form the bridge between these two worlds. HEOR generates the types of evidence that decision makers need, while HTA provides a structured framework for interpreting that evidence in light of health system priorities. Importantly, this bridge does not start only at the end of development. Even preclinical data implicitly shapes future HTA and HEOR questions through choices about comparators, outcomes, and assumptions about use and scale. When science and value are treated as completely separate domains, translation often fails, not because the science is weak, but because the evidence cannot support the decisions that need to be made. The implication is not that researchers should become HTA experts, but that early awareness of this bridge can fundamentally improve how research is designed. To see what happens when this alignment comes too late, let me show you a concrete example. Let me give a concrete real-world example that many of you will recognize. In Alzheimer's disease, enormous scientific effort has gone into developing monoclonal antibodies with clear biological activity. These programs were not weak. They were among the most expensive and sophisticated biomedical research. Yet, when these technologies reached health technology assessment bodies, the central question was not whether the biology was interesting, but whether the evidence answered the decision problem. Do patients meaningfully benefit? And is that benefit worth the opportunity cost to the health system? HTA agencies repeatedly emphasized that surrogate endpoints and biomarker changes had not been sufficiently linked to patient-relevant outcomes. This is not a story about science failing. It is a story about HTA questions being asked after the evidence generation strategy was already locked. And that is precisely why early HTA thinking matters. Not to restrict innovation, but to ensure that strong science produces usable evidence. After seeing how value questions can arrive too late, the natural question is, how can we anticipate them earlier without overcomplicating early research? One of the simplest and most powerful entry points is horizon scanning. Horizon scanning is not about predicting the future with precision. It is a structured way of staying aware of sorry, my screen is just popping up, that's why. Anyway, it's a structured way of, it has come, no problem. It's a structured way of staying aware of where health needs, technologies, and decision priorities are likely to be heading while research is still being designed. For researchers, this can be surprisingly lightweight. It may involve looking at how disease burden is evolving, whether alternative technologies are emerging, or what kinds of policy and system pressures are becoming more visible. The key insight is that research takes place over many years, but funding, assessment, and adoption decisions are made in a future context, not the one we see today. Horizon scanning helps align early research choices with the future context, so that strong science remains relevant when it matters most. Once we start looking ahead using horizon scanning, the next step is to translate that awareness into a clear research question. One of the simplest and most powerful tools for doing this is PICO. PICO stands for Population, Intervention, Comparator, and Outcome. It does not tell you how to do your science, but it forces clarity about what question your evidence is ultimately meant to answer. The population defines who the technology is intended for. The intervention clarifies what is being tested or developed. The comparator makes explicit what the technology would realistically be compared against in practice. And the outcome asks what result would actually matter for future decisions. In many projects, these elements remain implicit. The science moves forward, but the underlying question is never fully articulated. As a result, misalignment only becomes visible later, during funding review, assessment, or translational discussions. The value of PICO is not complexity, but transparency. It makes assumptions visible early when they are still easy to question, refine, and adjust. At this point, we move from asking the right question to asking a different kind of question. What would success actually look like if this innovation ever reached practice? This is where target product profile, or TPP, thinking comes in. A TPP is not a regulatory document, and and it is not something reserved for industry. Conceptually, it is simply a structured way of describing the intended characteristics of a future intervention before it exists. A good TPP forces us to be explicit across 3 dimensions. First, the clinical dimension. Who exactly is the target population? What level of benefit would actually matter? And what safety expectations are implicit? Second, the economic dimension. Not pricing, but affordability, resource use, and whether this could ever be scaled beyond a single center or grant. And third, the use case dimension, where this would be used, how it would be delivered, and what it would realistically be compared against. When this thinking is applied early, it doesn't restrict scientific creativity. What it does is sharpen it. It helps researchers choose endpoints more deliberately, prioritize experiments more strategically, and avoid generating excellent data that later turns out to be irrelevant. The key point here is this. It is often not the science that changes, but the focus. And that shift in focus can completely change the translational future of a project. Up to this point, we've talked about value in relatively general terms. What's important to understand is that decision makers do not assess value intuitively or informally. They rely on structured frameworks that guide what questions are asked, what evidence is considered relevant, and ultimately what gets funded or adopted. In Europe, one widely used reference is the UNECTA core model. It breaks value down into domains such as clinical effectiveness, safety, patient relevance, economic impact, and organizational or ethical considerations. Importantly, it makes explicit that value is not one-dimensional. At the national level, agencies like NICE in the UK apply very specific evidence expectations. These include not only clinical outcomes, but also comparative effectiveness, cost effectiveness, and increasingly patient-reported outcomes and real-world relevance. On a more methodological level, organizations such as ISPOR have developed value frameworks and multi-criteria decision analysis logic, MCDA logic, which explicitly recognize that decision-making involves trade-offs between multiple dimensions of value. The key point here is not that you need to memorize these frameworks or apply them rigidly in preclinical research. The key point is that these frameworks already exist and they silently shape how your future data will be interpreted. If early research ignores these logics, even excellent science may struggle later. If early research anticipates them, the same science becomes much easier to translate into funding, policy, and ultimately real-world impact. When people hear the term economic modeling, they often imagine something very late stage, highly technical and tightly linked to pricing or reimbursement decisions. That is not what I mean here. Early economic modeling is not about predicting cost effectiveness ratios or negotiating prices. It is about learning early how sensitive the potential value of an innovation is to the choices we make in research design. At this stage, models are intentionally simple. They are often decision trees or scenario analyzers that ask a very basic question. Under what conditions would this technology ever make sense for a health system? These models help us identify with which endpoints really matter, which assumptions drive value, and where uncertainty is most dangerous. In many cases, early modeling reveals that improving a single outcome, reducing variability, or changing the intended use setting would matter far more than adding another mechanistic experiment. So the purpose here is not precision, it is direction. Early economic models are a way of stress testing our research ideas against future decision logic, while there is still time to adapt the science. That is why I emphasize this point. Models at this stage guide choices, not prices. At this point, it's important to clarify what we actually mean by an HTA-ready study, because this is often misunderstood. An HTA-ready study is not one that already answers all HTA questions. That would be unrealistic, especially at preclinical stages. Instead, an HTA-ready study is one whose design anticipates future decisions. First, it has clear comparator logic. Even in early research, it is explicit or at least transparent about what the innovation is intended to replace, improve upon, or complement. This comparator should reflect real clinical practice, not just experimental convenience. Second, it pays attention to outcome relevance. Mechanistic or surrogate endpoints are often necessary early on, but they should be connected to outcomes that matter to patients, clinicians, and health systems. Otherwise, the translation becomes very difficult later. Third, an HTA-ready study considers feasibility and scalability. This does not mean optimizing costs at the bench, but rather being aware of factors that could make real-world use implausible, such as excessive complexity, unrealistic delivery settings, or unsustainable resource requirements. And finally, the data generated are decision relevant. They are produced with the understanding that one day someone will need to decide whether this innovation should be funded, adopted, or prioritized. So the key message here is simple. HTA ready does not mean HTA complete. It means being decision aware by design. Let me give you a concrete example of early course correction. Imagine a project with a very strong biological rationale and convincing preclinical data. Scientifically, everything looks solid. The implicit assumption is if this works, the system will find a way to use it. Now, when early HTA and HEOR questions are introduced, not at the end, but during the design phase, a different set of issues comes into focus. Questions like who exactly is the target population in real clinical practice? What would this be compared against, not theoretically, but in the health system today? Which outcomes would actually matter to patients and decision makers? And can this intervention realistically be delivered and afforded at scale? None of these questions invalidate the science, but they often lead to design adjustments, refining the population, rethinking endpoints, sometimes even reconsidering the setting or delivery mode. The result is not a weaker project, it is a stronger one, clearer, more fundable, and more credible in terms of real-world impact. This is what early HTA does. It doesn't change the science, it changes the trajectory. Rare diseases amplify every challenge we've discussed so far. Uncertainty is higher because data are scarce, natural history is often poorly understood, and assumptions have to be made earlier. Populations are smaller, which means there are fewer opportunities to correct course later. You don't get multiple chances to redesign trials or rethink endpoints once development is underway. At the same time, access barriers are higher. Even with small patient numbers, per patient costs are often substantial, which makes decision makers more cautious, not less. So in rare diseases, value cannot be assumed. It has to be explained, justified, and designed into the research from the very beginning. This is exactly why early HTA and HEOR are not optional extras in rare disease research. They are risk management tools that protect promising science from failing for avoidable reasons. This is the point where I want to deliberately reframe what we usually mean by market access. Market access is often treated as something that starts after clinical trials, as a negotiation with payers or regulators once the science is done. In reality, market access begins much earlier. It begins with the choices we make before the clinic, which populations we study, which comparators we implicitly assume, which outcomes we consider meaningful, and whether the intervention can realistically fit into a health system. What is often called the valley of death is rarely caused by weak science. It is usually caused by misalignment between what researchers optimize for and what health systems are actually able to adopt. And importantly, many of these misalignments cannot be fixed late. Comparator choices, outcome relevance, scalability assumptions. Once clinical development is underway, these become very hard or impossible to change. So the core message here is simple but fundamental. Access is not negotiated at the end. Access is designed from the beginning. At this point, a natural question is, what does all of this actually mean for IBG researchers? First, it's important to say that IBG already excels where it matters most: strong preclinical science, mechanistic depth, and biological innovation. Nothing I'm discussing today challenges that foundation. Where value-oriented thinking fits is not at the end of a project and not as an administrative add-on. It fits very naturally at the moments you already engage with. When you frame your research question, when you decide which outcomes matter, and when you are asked increasingly to explain societal or clinical impact in funding applications. What I often see, and this is not specific to IBG, are missed opportunities rather than mistakes. Relevance is assumed rather than articulated. Adoption is expected rather than designed. And impact narratives are sometimes treated as a formality rather than a strategic asset. The key point I want to emphasize is this: adopting early HTA and HEOR perspective does not change what you study. It strengthens how your science is understood, funded, and ultimately translated into real-world benefit. Up to this point, we've talked about tools, horizon scanning, PICO, TPPs, early modeling, and how they can shape better research designs. This slide is about something slightly different: collaboration. Value-oriented research almost never sits within a single discipline. It requires scientific insight, yes, but also an understanding of how health systems interpret evidence, uncertainty, and feasibility. The critical point is when collaboration happens, when external or complementary expertise is brought in early, before endpoints, comparators, or assumptions are fixed, it acts as a design accelerator. When it happens late, it often becomes damage control. Importantly, value-oriented collaboration is not about handing over ownership or being evaluated. It is question-driven, complementary, and iterative. Done early, it increases clarity, credibility, and the likelihood that good science will actually move forward. I'd like to briefly introduce BAU-HTA, which is an emerging platform currently being established within Bahcesehir University. BAU-HTA is designed as a university-based structure operating at the intersection of research, policy, and innovation, with a focus on health, life sciences, and biotechnology. Its copy is intentionally broad and outward-facing, aimed at national and international engagement. The platform is being developed to support HTA and HEOR research, early economic and value modeling, as well as advisory and consultancy activities related to evidence strategy and access relevant questions, all within an academic and ethical framework for the first time in Turkey. BAU-HTA is currently in its formal establishment phase, and the process has been progressing positively. While the institutional steps are still underway, the platform is being shaped with the expectation that it will operate as an active partner for researchers, institutions, and innovators. So rather than presenting a finished structure, I want to share the direction of a platform that is being deliberately built to connect evidence, value, and real-world impact. Before we close this section, I'd like to briefly place everything we've discussed into a global context. Health Technology Assessment International, or HTA-I, is the main global professional society where HTA agencies, policymakers, academics, clinicians, and innovators come together to discuss how evidence is actually used in real-world decisions. In 2026, this year, the HTA-I annual meeting will be held here in Istanbul. Registrations will be opening soon, and I think this is particularly relevant for researchers like those in this room. These meetings are not about promoting products or defending finished work. They are about questioning assumptions, about comparators, outcomes, uncertainty, and value, often much earlier than we expect. From my own involvement in HTA-I scientific and regional engagement activities, I can say that many of the issues we discussed today, early HTA, early dialogue, and designing for impact, are exactly the kinds of questions being debated in these global forums. So if you're interested in seeing how research ideas are interpreted once they leave the lab, and in engaging with the people who shape access decisions internationally, HTA-I 2026 offers a very concrete opportunity to do that. Let me leave you with 3 simple takeaways. First, impact does not happen by accident. Strong science is essential, but impact only emerges when research is deliberately designed with downstream use in mind. Second, health technology assessment and health economics and outcomes research are not late-stage hurdles or bureaucratic obstacles. When used early, they are design tools that help us ask better questions, choose more relevant endpoints, and avoid predictable dead ends. And third, better design leads to better outcomes, not only scientifically, but strategically. Clearer research questions lead to stronger funding narratives, more credible development pathways, and ultimately a higher chance that discoveries are actually used. In short, designing earlier helps us decide smarter and waste less effort along the way. Before we close, I'd like to leave you with an invitation rather than a conclusion. Much of academic research has been designed around outputs, publications, grants, and technical success. And those remain important, but increasingly, they are not the endpoint. What we've explored today is a shift from thinking only about outputs to thinking about impacts. Impact as something that is designed, not discovered by chance. That shift also changes how we think about rigor. It's not just about having the right answers at the end, but about asking the right questions early. Questions about relevance, comparators, outcomes, feasibility, and use. And finally, it invites a change in how research is designed. Impactful research is rarely a solo exercise. It increasingly emerges from dialogue with clinicians, patients, health systems, and decision makers long before a study reaches the clinic. So the invitation is simple, not to do less science, but to design science whose relevance is clearer earlier. Designing for impact is not a constraint on science. It is an expansion of its relevance. Thank you very much for your attention and engagement. My aim today was not to provide definitive answers, but to offer a way of thinking differently about how research impact is designed, especially early and especially in preclinical work.